Scarcity of unified, ethical and visionary leadership is now the single biggest risk facing South Africa. This is according to the Risk Report 2021 released by the Institute of Risk Management South Africa. It identifies new risks to the country if they are left unattended. Now, these risks are unethical leadership, public and private governance failures, corruption, new shifts in consumer behaviour and a failure to move forward in reforming the healthcare system. The report is in concurrence with President Cyril Ramaphosa's weekly letter to the nation a fortnight ago, where he spoke of the draft national implementation framework to build an efficient, capable and ethical state staffed by men and women who are professional, skilled and free from corruption. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this. Nicola, who is a committee member of the Institute of Risk Management South Africa's Intelligence Committee, as well as the Group Chief Risk Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, with us this morning. Good to have you, Nicola. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning, Leanne. Lovely to talk to you.
So how did the Institute come up with this ranking of the top 5 risks in the country?
Thanks for that, Leanne. I think that's a very interesting question because it really is such a tricky one to end up deciding which ones are those top risks. So the first thing that we do is we get views and opinions from all of the industry leaders across South Africa, along with the top risk managers in the country. So it's a whole combination of co-creation, really working with all the chief risk officers in the industry that are members of the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa, as well as others that are in the broader industry that might not be our members. And we also consult with industry leaders. So chief executive officer level, chairman of boards in both the public and private sector, MPOs, etc. And after those detailed conversations, very rigorous workshops are being held where we then debate as a group, the Risk Intelligence Committee, get together and we represented of a very wide, diverse group of specialists.
All right, looks like we've lost that connection with Nicola. We're going to try and sort out the connection and try and get her back up. It just seems to be a big problem these days with the bandwidth. But it's still, I can see the picture is still frozen. But this is just one of the issues that we're going to be discussing this morning. And obviously, this is something where we look and they're saying that top 5 risks that are found in 2021 and let me go through them again. It's the scarcity of unified, ethical and visionary leadership. These are just some of those that are the risks that South Africa is facing. But we'll continue to have this discussion. We're going to try and get Nicola back on the line at the moment. We need to take another break, so we might as well do it, and then hopefully we can get straight into that interview and get the questions. And hopefully the signal will be much better. So again, if you've just tuned in, a very, very good morning to you. So we're talking to a scarcity of unified, ethical and visionary leadership, which has now been identified as the single biggest risk facing South Africa. And this is according to the Risk Report 2021 released by the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa. And joining us now, she was with us just before the break, but unfortunately that link completely froze and broke down. We've got Nicola, who is the committee member of the Institute for Risk Management of South Africa and also is the Group Risk or the Group Chief Risk Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. All right, Nicola, let's try this again. Thanks again for being with us. So you started by telling us, and then of course that whole link just broke down, how you actually the Institute came up with the ranking of the top 5 risks in the country. Perhaps you want to quickly go through that for us.
Sure. So I think just in summary, it's essentially just bringing in all of the thought leaders across the country. Those are sitting in influential leadership positions in the public sector as well as the private sector, and combining chief risk officers like myself across the public and private sector arena and having a conversation and very lively debates and workshops, as you can imagine, just debating those top risks, using factors, considering what's happening locally, but also what's happening offshore and bringing that all together to really land on it. And maybe just to give you a feel of the report, we interviewed some very influential female leaders in South Africa in the report, especially given it's International Women's Day recently, like the chairman of the JSE, which is Nonkululeko Nyembezi, who's also a CEO of large mining companies in South Africa, one of Forbes, the world's 100 most powerful women. Also Basani Maluleke, who was the first black female CEO of a South African bank, and a lady known as Ziona Jacobs, who really was the pioneer behind the Cell C, Bring Girl Child to Work, who was an executive at Cell C. So really bringing in a lot of thought leaders, obviously men as well, but I just wanted to highlight some of the ladies' names.
Good. All right. So the report basically referring to them as the new 2021 top 5 risks. Now, 3 of these risks to the country are related to the lack of ethical leadership, public and private governance failures, and corruption. I mean, this is certainly not new to the country. The whole country has been talking about them for ages now. What should happen?
I think the key thing for us is when you talk about risk management, you don't just talk about the uncertainties. You also talk about the positive side of a risk, which is really the opportunities. And for me, the reason that we wanted to highlight these risks again is that there is definitely an opportunity. There's a vacuum of this unified ethical and visionary leadership. And you can really see an opportunity for the CEOs partnering with their chief risk officers, with their board members, to really step into that space, be more socially aware. We've seen a lot of talk about ESG, sustainability, making sure that you have a better impact on the planet, triple bottom line, not just focusing on profits, but also people and the planet, and really just taking up that opportunity to step into that vacuum, making sure that we capacitate law enforcement, that there's consequence management, and that we as corporate embrace this concept as well as public sector of whistleblowing, which really has been frowned upon historically.
I mean, the report goes on to say that one way of dealing with corruption, for example, is to reintroduce the ethics code of conduct and appoint suitably qualified experts in risk management positions. I mean, IRMSA should know that government already knows this, and there are instruments in place to deal with such, but it just doesn't seem to be working, and government doesn't seem to be acting on them. I mean, what do you think of this?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the point. Why we're stressing the concept of whistleblowing as well, because change starts within a board, within the conversations where one person in the room asks the question. I mean, we can look at some of the big corporate failures we've recently had. The reality is that the power of balance was just completely out of whack. There was one very strong CEO potentially around the table that made some decisions that others might have not agreed with, but they quietly ended up agreeing with because they didn't raise their voice. So it's about stepping into your voice, having a seat around the table, and each board member taking accountability, responsibility for the codes of ethics and asking those very difficult questions, putting the board on the spot. And even myself as a chief risk officer, having a very tough role to say to the board, these are the things I agree with. This is what my executive is doing that I'm not agreeing with. And really having to be really brave. So that's where we see ourselves as the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa, building those brave, ethical warriors of risk managers that go out into the industry and are able to raise these questions. Because it's not a new issue. It's been there all along. It's about starting the conversation and making people aware of the fact that this is not acceptable.
And it certainly isn't acceptable because, you know, we find ourselves as a country in a situation where we're currently seeing students all around the country protesting for education, burning tires. There's a threat of a nationwide lockdown. And, you know, when we talk about money and we talk about the amount of wasted money that we have just seen go into very few hands, it's the sad plight of the South African that struggles every single day to go out, get an education, find a job, enhance their skills, or do whatever it may be. But it's due to this corruption that we're seeing so many institutions fail. And at the heart of all of this is perhaps that leadership that we are lacking. What are the views in terms of this and seeing the failure of institutions?
So I think the key thing is there are various constructs around the country that's just not being leveraged appropriately. And I think it's a real, as I've mentioned earlier, the two sides of risk, having the uncertainty, but also the opportunity. I am really an optimist, and I suppose it comes through in my conversation. And these are really tough challenges we're dealing with. But the reality is I deal in my previous roles at the JSE, heading up markets. I deal with international investors in the US, in China, etc., all over the world. And when they look at South Africa, they say to us, guys, you're an emerging market. These are the sorts of things we expect to see. We love the fact that you've got first world technology, that you've got first world financial markets, and financial services industries. So we really are very interested in you as a country. And yes, these are challenges and you need to chip away at them. But the reality is you need to start somewhere. So for me, those green shoots that we're seeing in terms of action actually being taken, consequence management, and the reality is we just need to build onto that, because global investors look at us as one of the most favorable emerging markets to invest in. Yes, we have our challenges, but we have a beautiful growth story. We've got very passionate individuals, and it's just making sure that we actually leverage off those opportunities of public and private partnerships. And we've seen a lot of that coming through, and I certainly have seen that most recently with the conversations about being more sustainable, looking at social impact investments, and what are those specific things we can do? How can we better invest in education? How can we better invest in health? But we partner on both industry sides, and we focus on those majority that are not corrupt, because the reality is it is the minority. It's one or two sour grapes, and that is really just influencing the whole story.
I find it interesting that you say that it is, that South Africa is one of the most favorable emerging markets to invest in. And I mean, one would question that. And that's just being the critical side, saying, you know, when you look at the struggles that we're going through in terms of something like electricity supply, I mean, which company would want to bring investments into a country that genuinely struggles with electricity and the supply of energy for any business that is trying to make a profit?
Definitely. That's such an important point. I'm actually at the moment also I'm partnering with IRMSA on a project with Eskom, with some of their senior managers on the resilience team side. And we're working with the Financial Sector Contingency Forum to work on a national plan to really tackle this challenge of electricity, because I'm sure many of us are aware, but I don't think it's common knowledge that load shedding is really to protect the grid, to make sure that we're safe, that we don't have the same issues that we've recently seen in Texas, that we've seen all over the world actually happen. So electricity failures and the vulnerability of the grid is not a new issue. We've seen that in Venezuela and other countries. And so I think for me, again, on the positive side, it's that public-private partnership, the fact that I'm sitting on that industry committee, the fact that we're partnering with the Reserve Bank, with the large banks in South Africa, with Eskom to put this national plan together in terms of how will we tackle it and what are all those business continuity plans. So for me, the reality is issues will never go away. No. But our role as risk managers is really to bring everyone around the table, to bring everyone along the journey with us, and make sure that we have those backup plans in place and we think through what are the things we can do to respond to these challenges.
So just finally, as we wrap up the conversation, I mean, we've spoken quite a lot about the president who wrote that letter 2 weeks ago, talking to the professionalization of the public service with putting in very qualified CEOs, and that I know we have spoken to, so I won't talk too much about that, but that's one of the things that's been highlighted. But just the issue of a degenerating healthcare system for the general public. This is also not new, and the NHI is supposed to deal with this inequality, but many have already predicted problems that go back to the risks of leadership, corruption, governance, and an ethical public sector workforce. So the question keeps recurring on whether this government does have what it takes to turn South Africa's misfortunes brought by these factors around. I mean, we've been through COVID-19, we've been promised things are going to turn around and get better. What are you seeing?
I think I'm just reminded now, while you're asking the question, of the conversation I had with Dr. Azar Amin, who is a very renowned economist, and he's also quoted in the IRMSA risk report. And he was actually saying, which I found quite interesting, that COVID was actually a blessing in disguise for our country, because the reality is we were already struggling with corruption. We were already struggling with a massive debt crisis, etc. And COVID really just was that last straw on the camel's back to say, guys, now you have to actively do something about it. Now you have to get your forces together. You've got to mobilize the troops. You've got to really bring in those partnerships between government and the public sector, the private sector, corporate South Africa, and make sure that we practically do things. And I think, yes, we've had our failures even in those, because we are an emerging market. We need to remind ourselves of those third world country constructs we have in. We really have the privilege of having that combination of both of those worlds in a very interesting dynamic in South Africa. And just looking at the positives of what's actually been achieved during that period. And I'm just thinking of my own organization and all the other institutions I work with. being able to mobilize and get our workforce to work 100% remotely, and actually not having a grid failure or any massive ESCOM challenges during that period. So I really think there are, as I've mentioned, sort of green shoots. And yes, it's not perfect at this stage, but there are some positive stories that we can focus on, some elements where we've seen some success. And I can't emphasize the partnership element enough. And certainly that's what we are doing as the Risk Intelligence Committee, as well as the JSE.
Nicola, thanks for talking to us, giving us some hope in and amongst the darkness. So thank you very, very much for coming up onto the program and talking to us about the risk analysis and where we're at as a country in terms of that. All right, thanks so much. Let's quickly roll the sting, go into the 7 o'clock news, a little bit late, but here are your details.